that said, I'd like to welcome pen author and National Book Critics Circle Award-winning author Joan Silber. Joan is the author of Secrets of Happiness, Improvement, Fools, and she's here tonight to discuss her latest novel, Mercy, with Ben Johnson. We thank them both for coming. Welcome them both.
Well, I'll just start by saying something I always say, which is to thanks to everybody for patronizing independent bookstores. And, your job is to always and everywhere dun your friends into patronizing independent bookstores and get them not to order from certain criminal enterprises whose name will remain unmentioned. So I thank you, and I thank the staff at Oblong for being, such a great bookstore. That really, who could live here if we didn't have a bookstore this excellent? I'm actually going to read because Joan has many accomplishments, and I don't like all, and to assume that anybody doesn't know all of those accomplishments, and then I'll say a word or two about why I love Joan's writing, and this was drawn to this book in particular, and then I'll turn it over to Joan to read for a bit, and then we'll do a little back and forth, and then we'll have some questions from the audience. So that sounds like a way to go. Joan Silber is the author. I've known Joan since we taught together. There were several other Sarah Lawrence people. We taught at Sarah Lawrence in the late 1990s, so it's been a long friendship, I'm glad to say. She's the author of 10 books of fiction. Her previous book, Secrets of Happiness, was a Washington Post and Kirkus Review's Best Book of the Year and Oprah Magazine Most Anticipated Book. Improvement was the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Penn Faulkner Award. She also received the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in Short Story. Fools was longlisted for the National Book Award and was a finalist for the Penn Faulkner Award. Other works include The Size of the World, finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Fiction, and Ideas of Heaven, finalist for the National Book Award and the Story Prize. She lives in New York and has taught at Sarah Lawrence and Warren Wilson MFA program, but as she and I discussed, we are both now mercifully removed from the world of teaching, much as we loved the world of teaching. So a pretty distinguished resume. I like Joan's work for too many reasons to go into at such length, but one of the things that I so admire about it, frankly, because don't think I'm very good at it, I don't know if it's Hindu or not, but the dark side of the human character she explores in a way that is non-judgmental, which is a kind of very Hindu view of the world. I don't get the sense, the way I get, I'm sorry to say sometimes out of my characters, that I, the author, am standing behind them, peeking out saying, I would never do this sort of thing. I'm not this, don't confuse me with this person. And the characters in Mercy are very much illuminate that, as they did, as the characters did in the previous work of interlinked stories. And Joan and I talked about that as an ancient form, as old as the Hebrew Bible and Boccaccio, but most recently, to me, influential in Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, or a book I highly recommend if you've only read Louise Erdrich's later books. Her first collection, which is called Love Medicine, is superb, and I thought of it when I was reading Mercy. I also thought that Mercy could have been called Betrayal, interestingly enough, and I thought we might get into the exploration of that. I will say as well, I was drawn particularly to this book because I've thought for a long time about I've thought about writing an essay about how mercy is by definition, I think, a virtue of the powerful. You have to be in power to extend mercy. the most famous references that we know, which were in my mind, they probably weren't in yours, but mine throughout the book, were of course Portia's speech in Merchant of Venice, the quality of mercy is not strained, but also Marvin Gaye's fabulous song Ecology, Mercy, Mercy Me. So all of those things I felt were at a time when there was very little mercy in the world, and I wondered, I mean, you probably will shut up and get to this, but one of the things that I so loved about this book is it must have been written, completed in the way of American publishing at least a year-ish ago.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And yet it anticipates in certain ways the mood of the current moment. So all of those floated through my mind reading it, but I'll circle back to say that the form of the interlocked stories, which I would say Joan is a master of, is so engaging for me, and also, as I say, this capacity to show characters who are multidimensional, including their darknesses, in a way that allows us to access them from perhaps the dark regions of our own hearts. So having said that, you want to read us some passages?
Yes, I'm going to read from the beginning. That was terrific. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm just going to read from the beginning. Can you guys hear me? Am I loud enough? From teaching for many years, I usually project okay. I'm just going to read the first few pages. And the character who's talking to you is called Ivan, so it's a male voice talking. My daughters knew me as the father who made any news by announcing, "We'll deal with it." She understood this correctly to mean I'd seen bigger trouble than whatever the pissy little thing at hand was. What did I think big trouble was? A plague of deadly disease, a flood of rushing waters, a city lost in unbroken darkness. All these things came to pass in my girls' years of growing up, and we managed. I was always the guy insisting to friends who were in despair or outrage that everything would be okay. Keep your shirt on. I married late. What caught up with me? I might have gone on as I was, a guy in his 40s with a decent sex life. I had no need to join up, but Maddie, younger and more urgent, got us tucked into a cozy space together, sheltered. She had me growing delighted feelings about the great convenience of not always starting over, the beauty of being settled. I was 50 when Zoe was born, and the early years with her, that little petulant rapscallion, sat very well with me. By the time Zoe was in college, she found many occasions to tell me that my generation had fucked up in every major way. We'd ruined the planet. We'd let a criminal 1% own everything. We'd gotten everyone used to constant war. Our current life form was an invasive species, worse than kudzu, choking out anything around us. My dear daughter, I'd had my own scorn and gloom at her age, but my sullenness seemed now like the frivolous affectation it was. What's the worst thing you've ever done? She asked late at night, just the two of us. In the living room of her Brooklyn apartment, done watching Netflix, sitting on the couch, eating the last of the ice cream out of the carton. Cheating my high school friends at poker, I said. Lying to your mom about liking her kale salad. I had no interest in giving her a serious answer. But I knew what the worst thing was. It was an untold bit of personal history, and it was staying that way. My business. I knew what I'd been. The details did not bear discussion. Zoe always complained that there were hardly any pictures of me in my wayward youth. A lame-ass college photo with rimless glasses, and a few from the time I spent bumming around Europe or driving a taxi in New York in the 70s. She always made fun of my mustache and sideburns in the Europe ones. Girls liked them, I told her, which had some degree of truth in it. If you're an older father, the way you once looked is innately hilarious. But I was glad for the long distance between my coming of age and hers. I wanted her safe from mine. The one picture I liked of me in London, sitting on a park bench, the one picture I liked was of me in London, sitting on a park bench, smoking a cigarette. Eddie must have taken it. I'm glowering into the camera, exhaling a cloud of smoke, squinting at what's ever out there, looking, in my morose way, pleased with myself. I'm not high either. Eddie and I spent a lot of time in parks. In New York, he could amble into almost any park, and within 10 minutes, he knew who was selling what and for how much. London was harder. We didn't come in knowing how to read things, but any drug was cheaper. We did have some cash, our separate savings, me from driving a cab, Eddie from tending bar. They had to last a while. We hadn't figured out what we'd do when it ran out. Something. Why were we so dedicated to drugs? Eddie would have said that was like asking why anyone likes sex, which not everyone even does. To me, because it feels good was not the answer. What we wanted in our way was to go over the edge, our private elsewhere. We wanted transcendent flings, further steps. Far out was a cliche of our era, but to us it meant something for which we had only blunt slang. Not for us, the daily grind of the ordinary slob, the nothing special days and weeks. We were better than that. We liked to talk about our highs, how good they were or not, their particulars. In New York, we had done some of everything, but in London, we got to love the local heroine. Guys with our highly conscious views might seem drawn to psychedelics, but they were too much of a production. The flashing coils of light in our field of vision, the pulsing hallucinated patterns that went on for hours. We liked the simplicity of the ancient poppy, its pure message.
Well, oops. You got a,
Excuse me.
Do you need
No, it's fine. It's just water.
got a paper
A
towel?
paper towel, sorry. Thank you. Only water.
So, maybe that's a place to begin, because you have this character who is a kind of unapologetic heroine.
Yes, yes.
And I really admired how you, I mean, I don't know if everybody can say this about their families, but certainly my family has a long history of addictive behaviors of one kind, most often alcoholism, and I'm very familiar with addictive behavior, and yet this person seemed really multidimensional and multifaceted. I want to talk about the development of that.
Well, the novel started because as a New York resident for most of my adult life, I've always heard stories of the incident that becomes I can reveal this because it happens within 10 days, but in New York hospitals, overdosed people are often left on the steps of the hospital or maybe in the emergency room. And I always thought there's some hidden drama in that. Someone took them there and left them. And we certainly know every time a celebrity overdoses, somebody goes to jail, right? So it's not like you're not liable if you had something to do with it. So I wanted that as the premise, which already involved heroin rather than other drugs. So I wanted them to talk about that and to talk about the variations in that. And certainly one of them is much more of an addict than the other, and you'll find that, and we see that sort of unfold. But one of the So the first story is really about the first chapter is really about one abandoning the other among all the other things around it. But one of the continuities in it also is the poppy, as they call it, because it appears in the context you just heard now, when they're buying it in England, where it's easier to purchase. And then it appears later on when one of the characters is an anthropologist, and she's spending time in Southeast Asia, where I have spent time in Thailand and Laos. And the indigenous groups, although now they often sell it for profit, but for many years they just raised it in the gardens as a handy medicinal. And you'd be glad to have it if you had no other drug, right? And it's much milder in the form of opium. And then there's a latter, so we see that. We see it brought to actually ease someone's pain at some point in the story. And then we see it the way many of us will encounter it, a morphine pump in a modern hospital as the most effective painkiller. So I wanted to get that sense of its circle, because I think we're trying, I mean, I'm not a writer who's very black and white in the way I write anyway, so I wanted to get that sense of the possibilities of it. But I also did want to get, maybe out of the same impulse, I wanted to get a character who is an addict but is also a person, who isn't easily dismissible under that guise, and who we see go in and out of things. Was that your question?
Yeah, well, I like these conversations. I want to go a little bit sideways to address the issue of form, which we talked a little bit about, and I was very curious as to whether in this interlinked form it's so complex, and does it evolve across these many characters? The form in question, some of the minor characters are major characters. A major character will be a minor character in another chapter. And that happens both in Joan's earlier books. What is the process that you use for, do you have an outline or you just let the thread follow you follow the thread that takes you where it wants to go?
Closer to that. I mean, I don't know what I'm doing until I do it. And when I finish one section, I'm pulling at it. So in this first chapter, 3 of them are shooting dope together, and one of them is a young woman who's the girlfriend of one of them, who is then going by the name Ginger. And then she ends up having her own chapter and story. So she's a great example of someone who's a minor character and one becomes major in the other, and who also draws together various things. So I like doing that, partly because I don't have enough of an idea for a novel when I start. So it allows me ways to kind of invent things around it, and one invention leads to another. But then I'm looking at a friend of mine when he was teaching. My friend Chuck used to say that a story, when you're trying to figure out a story to revise it, it's like interpreting a dream. And I'm sort of doing it in a way that I write, I think, in a way that that makes it sound, more adorable than it really is. It's much messier than that. But I'm trying to figure out what I'm getting at thematically. So I know that this one character has done something more reprehensible than not, although there are worse things he could do, and lives with it for the rest of his life. So I know I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about betrayal, as you said, and then the other things associated with that begin spinning out in the story. So there are thematic links. So by the end, not only do you find out what happened to this or that, but you're also coming to a conclusion of what to make of it emotionally by the end of the book. Because that's sort of what a novel is about, right? It's about what to make of all this stuff emotionally, because it always has, whatever kind of novel it is, it has many threads, and then it has some sort of conclusion. So I love that. I love that pattern of it.
I was really drawn, I was delighted that you asked me to do this, but I was immediately drawn because that word has always held some rich and resonant place in my consciousness, that is to say, mercy. And I, in fact, of course, when I was reading the book, everywhere some version of the word mercy appears, I made a little mark in the margin and sort of thought about that, and then also, thought about how one could also call the book betrayal. And I wondered whether, did you have the idea of, I'm going to write a book where this, $7 word is the title, or did the title arise organically out of the stories chapters as you were writing them?
I certainly started it with the idea that it was going to be about betrayal and remorse. And then Ron, who is here, will remember my saying this to them in conversation. I got more interested, that seemed like the right word for it to me. I got more interested in the workings of mercy and how they were going to play out in the book. And as I always say when people quiz me about it, I don't think of mercy as the same as forgiveness. I would like to think I wish mercy on everyone, although I probably don't. And I certainly ask for it for myself quite constantly. We ask for it every day. And as somebody says in the novel, there's not enough of it in the world. But it's not this. It doesn't mean that sin should be forgiven. It means that compassion is required. And of course, opium, which plays such a role, and opiates in the book, is the drug of mercy. I mean, it's our. Somebody refers to it as the resin of mercy in one part. I mean, it's the pain release. So it's a concept with a lot of rounding and complications to it, which I quite liked.
I have in my notes, mercy is not the same as forgiveness, but they are intimately related.
Yes.
And I thought, one of the things that I so liked about the title of the book and then its investigations is that you present mercy to us in a kind of global way, I guess, as well as its individual manifestations in these people's stories. And I wondered whether your time, I think I did know that you had spent some time in Southeast Asia, but I wondered whether your exposure to those and interest in those traditions and their very different views of the world influenced your writing of these stories, with the exception of one adventure a little bit off screen that goes into Southeast Asia. Most of them are set in the West. And I wondered whether those Asian traditions had an influence in your conception of the book and your conception of the philosophies surrounding it.
Yes, in a number of ways. I had been interested in Buddhism for 25 years at least, and wanted to go to Asia, not so I could go into a monastery. I mean, I wasn't as driven as some people are, but I wanted to be around that, and I wanted to see that and sort of absorb more of it. So I went as a tourist, to the sort of standard places in Southeast Asia for years, and then about 10 or so years ago, I spent like a month teaching English as a second language in Laos, and often to little Buddhist monk kids, actually. And also I did very briefly in Thailand. So, and that's also a part of the world where opium has always grown. I mean, it grows all over the world pretty much, but that's been a source of income and a part of it. So all of that is folded into each other. But certainly when people ask me about my belief system or what are my spiritual or religious ideas, I mean, I'll always be Jewish. I was raised Jewish. I'll never not be a Jew. But my beliefs are really much closer to Buddhism, even though I'm not really a practitioner. I'm not a meditator. But the notions, and you can see them sort of folding in the story, the notions about impermanence and the notions about the role of the ego are very important to me and very sustaining to me. And of course, as a writer, you don't want them clunky in your book. The last thing you want is to write a preachy book. So it's a very delicate matter to use the best of you in a book, but not have it be like overly instructive or didactic or something like that. So it's taken me a long time to kind of deal with that.
Well, I think, as I was suggesting maybe in my introduction, what I admire and want to learn from is that your capacity to write from a point of view without the point of view dominating what it is
Yes.
that the narrative, that it is not a didactic narrative. But I found myself wondering, these characters are so like, well, us.
Yeah, they're
in that they
yeah.
stumble around,
Yeah.
and their intentions are, or they think their intentions are usually good, but in fact they end up using each other and abusing each other
Yeah.
sometimes in fairly terrible ways, which makes them a lot like, us. I found myself wondering, what do you conceive of as the source of mercy? Do you see what I'm saying?
Would that I have?
Who is it that is, I think the question I wrote was, what or who is the bestower of mercy? Because the people all want mercy, and occasionally they even give it to each other.
Right.
Although
Well,
often
so-
not.
Well, I think there's two parts to that. There's many parts to that question. But one is, who is the bestower and what's the motive for it, is part of what you're asking. And I think the motive for it is a sense that we are all in the same boat. That that everything really is connected. I mean, hence the form, that we're all connected, and even the most sort of honorable and appealing characters are culpable. So that's important. What was the second part? I just lost my answer.
Well, who or what is a bestower?
Oh, and so it should be everyone. It should be everyone. As you said when we were talking about it, it's often the more fortunate who's able to bestow mercy. I mean, being on the bottom does not make people generous. I used to give, when I taught at Warren Wilson, we had to give lectures on particular topics, and I gave one that I've re-given in lots of places because I like it, on generosity. And I meant generosity as an author towards character more than anything else, and that's important to me. So you want to be able to see the character clearly. Obviously, if you're sentimentalizing the character, nobody wants to read it. Everybody knows better than that, But you don't want to make the character hateful. You want to condemn the character either. I like that. I like the mechanics of that and working that out. One of the things I always say about the form, too, I don't know why I feel obliged to say this again, but I will, is that the idea of the form with all these different parts that sort of fit together is slightly inspired by my mother saying when I was a child, "You're not the only pebble on the beach." And parents talk that way more than they don't speak that way to their children that way. But it just meant don't be so selfish, and was not, of course, welcome news. But now I think it's about, now I like the idea that there are all these different pebbles on the beach. I actually don't want to hear my own story over and over. I know my own story. So that spreading of, the idea that there's a large beach with all this stuff on it is wonderful to me, and is, I think, part of the impulse of fiction, to get as much in as possible. I'm always using my own emotions. I can't use an utterly different kind of character, but I like to spread it as much as I can.
I've used, both in teaching and in my own writing, the metaphor of architecture a lot. I think of, I say to the students, what is the architecture of your book? Design, draw what you think a book might be.
That's a great assignment.
And in this book, I found myself thinking again of Asian, this sort of wheel, or where there is a hub with spokes connecting out to different characters, and then in a sort of, you might say, Taoist way or whatever, the wheel turns, and the hub becomes a different character.
I like that.
That struck me as a kind of schemata of how the book...
Where the little thing is a bigger thing later on.
Yes, exactly, and also the connections between the characters. And I like your idea that, in a way, that's a more resonant and profound examination of how we live in the human condition as opposed to a linear narrative that focuses on a single character that follows that character from beginning to end. Having said that, I said to my students many times, don't ever write that book. And then my last novel, I decided I was going to write a linear narrative that progressed in a chronological fashion from beginning to end.
Well, great books have been written in that
Exactly.
Yes.
So do you know, I mean, for example, Astrid, Ginger, a.k.a. Astrid, you have her in mind at the beginning as a major, who's somebody who's later going to become a major character? Or you write that first chapter and you say, I've been given this character, or this character has presented herself to me, so let's go there.
A little of both, but more of the latter, I would say. Sometimes I have to look for, sometimes I really don't know that I'm going to use someone. But Astrid I sort of always knew because she's the female on stage when the action is happening. And I think I maybe had already made her an actress. I didn't know she was going to do well at it, as she ended up doing. I did have one friend who was an actor. She didn't become hugely famous, but she had, I'd see her on soap operas and stuff like that. So I knew a little bit about the mechanics of that life, and I wanted to do that. And of course, as a child, I always wanted to be an actress or a movie star. So you get to kind of play that out too in what you wrote. Sometimes it's more incidental. There's a story about a character called Kara who was created just because I wanted someone else in the emergency room when this sort of crucial thing happens where he deserts his friend. I wanted someone else to view it. So I invented this 10-year-old kid who's been dancing around on the fire escape and hurt her leg, and so she sees one abandoning the other. And then I folded her story in it and so forth. But when I wrote her story, which I was pleased with, she has a friend who says, totally for the convenience of the story, the friend is studying anthropology and says, sexual behavior is a social construct. And I thought that was such a great line. It's written over, we've all seen sexual mores change radically, in the past, 25 years. I mean, it's been very rapid. So anyway, so I made her, and that's how she got to Thailand, because if I was going to send her anywhere, I had more qualifications to send her there, and I got to do that.
Let's see what the other. Oh, I wanted to ask you about. This is more of the sort of form and style thing, but so there are a number of points of view that you are writing from, individual first-person points of view, and then at the end of the book, you are writing from third-person
Right.
point of view. And I thought it might be interesting to talk about. One of the obvious questions is writing from a man's point of view as opposed to writing from a woman's point of view in the first person, and then that question, and then the question of writing from the first person point of view as opposed to the third person point of view. Why would you choose one? What are the advantages or disadvantages, and particularly in the context of this particular book?
They used to make a big deal about genders writing about, how could you write about a man's point of view with your? And I would think, I've been around men a lot, I mean, it's not a hidden thing. There are things I wouldn't do. There are social realms of life that I don't feel qualified to write about, but I could do the gender jump. I've used a lot of first person. When I started writing, this is, I think, the 5th book I've done that's in this, lots of different, characters talking. And I think I like the intimacy of first person for it, particularly because we don't have that much time with them, so first person. And I'm interested in what people make of what's going on. The thing that I've always loved about fiction is that it has inner and outer both at once. So when I was teaching a class on character a couple of years ago, I said, in fiction you can say, I love you, she lied. Right. So we get what you would say and what you thought. So first person is really we do know pretty much what the person thinks. We're not just putting it together from watching them. So I love that. I don't think of close third as being that different, but it's a little different. And in this book, it's a character who's been sort of in the distance. So I wanted to sort of underline that by using the third. I don't think I thought about it that much, and I think that I originally had other parts of the book originally written in third and then put them in first. There's such a trial and error process in writing a novel, and when you finish it, you think, oh, I always knew what I was doing, but I truly didn't. Now I think I do. Now I think it's.
So I have a novel that is all the chapters, Newspaper Rock, all the chapters are third person. And then the last chapter is first person, which is the inverse of what we were talking about.
And why do you think you did that?
And I know exactly because there's an elderly woman who lives next door, and the chapters are told in third person because she's watching everything that goes on. But when I came to the end of it, she insisted on telling her story. And I kept saying to myself, no, every chapter in this book is from the third person. I cannot switch to first person at the end of the book. And I would change all of the first persons to third person because I just said I can't do that. And she would say, I want to tell my story. And so in the end, I gave in, and it was exactly the right thing to do, because so it was interesting to me that instead of having an observer in the first 3/4 of the book who then tells the story in the first person, you have first person stories and then move, in a way, pull the camera backwards if you want to look at it in that sort of way. And it was interesting to see the inversion of those, how those contrasted each other.
In Improvement, although I had forgotten this until we're talking about this, but in Improvement, most of it is in third, and the enveloping story, the characters begin first. So having the same thing in the first and the last is sometimes good because it kind of scoops up the story for you.
Yeah.
That's what you do.
I'm going to ask one more question and then ask if you all have any comments or questions you want to ask, and then there'll be some time to sign books and chat and whatever. But so, do you think of the overarching, enveloping cosmos of the book as mercy or betrayal? Because I kept, as I say, made a note to myself, saying you could call it, this book could have been called Betrayal.
Yeah, there's plenty of other betrayals in it, as there always are.
I'm glad that it was called Mercy. But it could have been called Betrayal.
Yeah. And I'm glad it wasn't called Remorse either, because that was the other possibility, because that's, I'm not against remorse, but it's not enough by itself. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of, in fact, most religions say that if remorse has to be accompanied by recompense, so I didn't want to go all the way into there. The question was, do I think it should have been called Betrayal?
No,
you didn't
just there is a larger let's call it an emotional cosmos in which the book is taking place. And it's interesting you bring up remorse because you have characters and situations which are very, again, true to how we live, which is someone cannot work out their remorse because the person to whom they should be making amends is dead, is gone, or out of their life or whatever. And so I guess I felt that just asking you as the novelist, philosopher, maybe to talk about the action of mercy, or the action of betrayal and the action of mercy, and how they interact with each other.
What I think of when you ask about it is, in a novel, you would want both of them. Because you don't want, you could have just betrayal, but it would be a different kind of novel than I write. It would be more like a crime novel, or a dark kind of mystery than I'm interested in. But if you only had mercy and everything's fine, like, where's the story? So the fact that you want to ask that question is what I want. That they're at odds, but they also work together in the process of the world. And I don't have a single, I have to say, because it's not a single line novel, there isn't one thing that comes out a certain way because people, it's not instructive in how to behave. It's really instructive in the way to view it. So I want mercy to be in people's minds somewhere, but it can be a little distant. It's not pushing on them too much.
I will say before turning it over that you do have, among many other great lines about various aspects of these people's lives, you have great writing about acting. I wondered whether you had yourself been or aspired to be an actor.
No,
Astrid's thoughts about what acting is, skating over the surface, all of that, I was really wonderful.
I've known people who acted, so I know, and also I think it is a lot like writing fiction, in that you're inhabiting the character. You have to use your own emotions to do it, and you're inhabiting the character, and you're trying to be out of yourself, and so forth. There was sometimes when people ask me about certain characters and how I could do them and so forth. I think of Cate Blanchett, who's of course a fabulous actress, was being interviewed about the movie Carol, in which she plays a 1950s lesbian with fabulous clothes. And it's a very complicated story, a wonderful story. And the question, they probably just wanted to ask her something, right? So the question is, was it a challenge for you as a straight woman to play the part of this woman who's attracted to other women? And she says, as well she might, this was reported to me, so I may not be getting exactly right, but the basic thing she says is, I'm an actress. If I played a murderer, you wouldn't think it was really remarkable that I never killed anyone. So it's interesting, there are kinds of emotions we're perfectly happy to imagine that we're capable of, that we could all imagine a murderer. We can't all be murderers, obviously, but we assume through all of us having lifetimes of reading these things that we can imagine a character who does such a thing. But other stuff is a little more taboo to us, right? So I'm very interested in that process also, and how a writer enters through imagination, how it enters certain characters and uses. I almost never have a character who's like a big executive who's in love with power, because it's just a little too foreign to me. And there's plenty of other people to write those books. But there are other emotions that I can easily transfer. I can do envy. I can do someone who's lovelorn. I can do, and they manifest themselves in all sorts of ways. And I love that process. I love being a fiction writer.
Are there any comments about it? Please.
It's playing off what you've already discussed, but your compassion for your characters, which or generosity, as you mentioned, which I think is one of the things that makes your writing feel so non-judgmental, as Fenton said. Are there some characters where it's more of a struggle than others? Or have you ever had to have a kind of fight with a character in your head to be able to reach that part of that moment of compassion, or so that you can understand them from the inside out, even if they're doing something or behaving or they're not even very nice?
Well, some of them aren't forgiven in them. They're not. I'm not generous to all of them. I don't think, because if it's a minor character and they just behave badly, I don't need to go into them closely. But the most sort of signal enactment of that was in Ideas of Heaven. There's a character who's terrible, and the story is told by a woman who is tormented by her dance master, who deliberately humiliates her. And then the next story, in fact, this is how I started doing a group, different characters. Yeah. The next story is told from his point of view. And he is, a poor schnook in many ways and is suffering at the hands of various characters. But he's often mean and tormenting. He's not vicious, but he's pretty snotty to everybody, Yeah. So I loved the act of doing that. But I knew I was going to do that with him. I think there are people worse than him in some of my stories. We just don't see them. We don't get close enough to them. I don't know that I've struggled though. That's a really interesting question. Like, have there been any that I wanted to be more compassionate towards and I haven't? That hasn't happened, I don't think.
Question to Jim. I'd say I've struggled a lot with some of the characters in my books. I can't bear them, but I have to write them. I have to try to be inside of them.
But your book is their last book is very complicated and political and what they do. I'm sorry, but
Yeah, but that's okay.
Steve's dealing with other stuff.
I just that topic was really interesting to me because I have struggled. But actually, I was thinking about this. I've often thought about the way you compose your books, and one of the things I was wondering as I was listening to you read, like, was this the first story you wrote? That first chapter, did
Yeah.
you actually, and you basically said that it was,
Yeah.
yeah. And then I got an idea about how it then had developed from the things you said. But the other thing that's really interesting about your books is they do have themes that are developed and come back again and again. And so, you've got this one thing, which is the structure of like getting the stories to work together. And the other thing, though, is the development of the theme. And I'm wondering how that comes to pass for you and to what degree. For instance, do the themes, the various stories you tell, do they kind of naturally focus on the themes because that's just what you're interested in? Or as you begin to go through the book, do you realize, oh, I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about mercy, I'm thinking about improvement, and then does that affect the way you structure the book?
I mean, I would say both. We don't want that as an answer. But sometimes I know more in advance.
Mm-hmm.
Like some books I've really known right away, oh, I'm going to talk about this. And then this one I didn't know right away. It really did change as I worked on it. I always say my method is trial and error. So, there's often sections where I'm going in the wrong direction. And then by pulling myself back, I learn what I really mean. But I think as a young writer, I was told not to have too many ideas. I don't think anybody said it that way, but the theory was to not, don't explain, don't complain, don't explain, and don't be laden with ideas or beliefs. Don't be too bald about it. And I didn't buy that. So, and I'm glad that I did. My writing would have been weaker without that.
Right.
Do we have another question? We may take one more question. Yes, please.
Yeah. First of all, I've read 3 of your books. I really enjoyed them. Improvement, Secrets of Happiness, and Sides of the World. And one of the things I just wonder...
You have to read Fools. That's my favorite.
Well, I'm not finished. We're not reading them yet. So, yeah. So I just was wondering, in terms of your structure, I wondered if you have these stories and have you had to move them around and say this one should really come after this one or before that one. I think it's wonderful how I've searched okay, which one is this going to be related to, and then I find out that, well, she's the mother from 30 years ago. But I just wondered how you arrange them, and do you ever move them around, or is it just comes out that way?
I do move them around. Sometimes not. Sometimes they just fall into place, and sometimes they're pretty chronological. So it moves along. But sometimes, in this one, the Astrid, the tale of the actress. Now it's the second chapter in the book, is it? But I think at some point I had it further on. I thought it was going to be further on, and then I moved it back. So a lot of writers know more about what they're doing before they do it than I do. I really am. I'm trying and experimenting and see what's exposed about that. Someone asked me recently, were there any characters, whose stories you started to write and then you didn't use them? And I said, oh no, not with this one. And then, of course, 2 days later, I remembered that in the early drafts, Astrid, the actress, plays the role of a distinguished older British woman in Hong Kong in the 1930s who is making an attempt to commit suicide through eating opium. I mean, it's actually, opium isn't that strong, it's hard to kill yourself with it, but people have managed. It doesn't taste good, and it's easy to throw up from. But I had this my idea was, so before it was this movie whose plot has been described in part of the book, and caught the echoes of what opium is, and the Chinese use of opium is really interesting, and I read a lot about it and stuff like that. So I wrote this. Maybe there was a whole novel that this movie was based on. So I'll pretend that I'm writing a novel in this section. And I had written maybe 20 pages, and they just were too artificial. I mean, of course, it took me a long time to admit that, but they weren't going in the same way other things are going. So that happens too. That's part of the process. I'm discovering stuff, and I'm uncovering it, and then reading, and then recovering. So you don't always know. You don't know what's gonna. I mean, I like that process, although not when it's going wrong. But the struggle of doing it is interesting to me as a writer.
I would like to go back, if I may, just to follow up again a little bit, because you said about, when you were talking about going to you'd written this character who was behaving with the dance teacher, and then you went into first person with him.
Yeah.
Because I found, because I switch first and third person and points of view a lot too in my books, that going into first person with people who might be hard to understand, their behavior might be hard to accept, is it almost doesn't let you villainize them, because you've got to make them so human through the first person. Even if you end up not keeping first person, you sort of get to know them.
Yes. It is as if you played the part.
And then they unfold as full people, not just as their bad behavior. Do you find that?
Well, there's a wonderful Chekhov story, I think, that when you talk about it, it's called At the Manor, and it's not a really well-known one, but it's about a guy who is the head of a, manor house in the country that's going very poorly. They're losing money right and left, and his daughters need to be married off, and there's a local guy in the neighborhood who comes to the house, and they're all very happy. But he goes into these long speeches. We all know this, right? Today, he goes into long speeches about his political opinions, and he doesn't even believe himself, but he just goes on. And it turns out, and he's talked about, how the serfs are getting too, powerful, and they should all be, done away with. And the guy who's come to the house, it turns out, had a grandfather who was a serf, and has, so he's totally insulted this guy. But what goes on in this story that's really interesting is that at first when you hear this guy speak, you think, what an asshole, he's the most right-wing person of this era, I can't stand him. And then when he realizes that he has offended his daughters, whom he loves, and he has ruined their chances, he's in pain, and he's genuinely repentant, and you feel for him. And then there's another moment in the story where he starts doing it again because he can't stop. And I just, he does this in like 10 pages. But I just think that's brilliant, because the helplessness of people in front of their vices, we all know this from our own lives, right? I do this stupid thing that I was never going to do again, and here I am doing, so I love that. I love getting that in, again, I think fiction is particularly powerful in being able to get that, distant and far at once.
It occurs to me that the source of mercy should be the reader for the characters.
Oh, yes. That's wonderful. I'm going to steal that.
Maya, maybe one more question.
Oh, well, I am embarrassed to admit that I am not a Joan Silber reader, but I am about to become one.
Oh, good. That's why you're here. Thank you.
And thanks to Fenton, who was a new friend, and I had read something about you, and then after Fenton, it was announced that this was happening, I looked you up, and I was like, where have I been? How did you miss her? So, which book should I start with? I'm going to get this one, but which book should I start with?
Well, I still like Ideas of Heaven, which was the first book I did in this form and came out in 2004. And that sort of goes all over the world in a way that is kind of satisfying. Okay. And I like Fools, too. You like Fools. Fools is about anarchists in the early 20th century, and then goes on to later in time.
My kind of book. Thank you.
Well, Joan will stick around and sign
Yes, I will
books,
sign.
and we'll stick around and chat. Thanks again to Oblong